I was 9 years old the first time my mother-in-law decided she knew exactly who I was. She hadn't met me yet. That didn't seem to matter to her. My name is Elaine Holloway, and I'm 31 years old. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, in a house where my parents were the kind of people who showed up to every school play, every hockey practice, every parent-teacher interview, even when there was nothing to report. My dad still drives 40 minutes to bring me soup when I'm sick. My mom still texts me good morning most days. I say this not to brag, but because it matters to the rest of this story. Because for a long time I thought all families were shaped roughly the same, and learning that they were not almost cost me everything I had built. I met my fiancé, who I'll call by his first name, Theo. Wait, no, I will not use that name. I'll call him by who he is to me now, my husband. I met my husband at a work conference in Ottawa 3 years ago. We were both there for different companies in the same sector. Environmental consulting on his end, municipal planning on mine. He was the one who mispronounced a French word in front of a room full of bilingual Ontarians and somehow made it funny instead of embarrassing. I laughed. He caught my eye. By the second morning, we had eaten breakfast together and discovered we both grew up near Lake Huron, and both had strong opinions about whether Tim Hortons had gone downhill. He said yes. I said the breakfast sandwiches were still fine. We compromised on the coffee. We dated for 2 years before he proposed, which he did on a Tuesday in November, standing in the parking lot behind our favorite ramen place in Kensington Market, because the waiter had accidentally seated us next to a table of very loud birthday people, and my husband, being my husband, had suggested we just eat outside in the cold, and I had said yes because I was already so comfortable with him that a parking lot in November felt like enough. He had the ring in his jacket pocket. He said later he'd been carrying it for 11 days waiting for the right moment, and the parking lot wasn't the plan, but it felt more like us than any plan he'd made. I said yes before he pulled the ring all the way out. We set the wedding for the second Saturday in August. The venue was a converted barn about an hour north of Toronto, surrounded by fields that went gold by late summer. We had been planning it for 8 months. I had a dress. I had a florist. I had a best friend, a woman I've known since first-year university named Philippa, who had already given 3 toasts at various events in her head and was prepared to deliver all of them. What I also had, quietly and persistently, was his mother. Her name is Lorraine, and she is the kind of woman who describes herself as blunt, in a tone that suggests she considers it a virtue. She lives in a suburb of Hamilton, and she has 2 sons, and she has spent approximately 30 years being the center of both of their lives in a way that was never going to survive either of them getting married. My husband is the older one. I was her first test case. She had decided things about me early. I was too independent, which she said to my husband within the first month of us dating, and which he told me about with an expression that suggested he wasn't sure how to file it. Too career-focused. Not the type to prioritize family. She had, I learned much later, said to a mutual friend of hers and his, that she didn't think I would ever really commit. That I was the kind of woman who kept one foot out the door. I had never given her any specific reason to think this. I had been to every family dinner. I had helped with dishes without being asked. I had listened to her talk for 3 hours about a renovation dispute with her neighbor without checking my phone. I had done all the things you do when you are trying to be someone's daughter-in-law and they are trying to decide whether to let you. She never quite let me. But it was manageable. I had learned to read the room. I kept a little distance, stayed polite, made sure my husband and I were solid enough that her opinions didn't land between us like wedges. We were solid. We talked about everything. When she said something that stung, I told him, and he listened, and we didn't let it fester. I thought we had a system that worked. Then, 6 weeks before our wedding, he called me from his car on a Wednesday afternoon, and his voice had that particular flatness. That means someone is working very hard to stay calm. He told me that his mother had contacted my previous employer. Not to ask for a reference. Not to find out where I worked now or to send something to my office. She had called the HR department of the firm I had left 2 years ago. A civil engineering company where I had worked for 4 years before moving to my current position, and she had told them that she was looking into a complaint that had been filed against me, that there had been a misconduct allegation, that she needed to know if it had ever been resolved. My husband said the HR coordinator had been confused and hadn't given her anything, which was the appropriate response since there was nothing to give, because no such complaint had ever existed. But the HR coordinator had mentioned it to a former colleague of mine, someone I had stayed in touch with, and that colleague had texted me that same afternoon, And I had been sitting at my kitchen counter staring at my phone for 20 minutes before my husband called. He asked me, carefully, whether there was anything at my old job that I needed to tell him about. And I want to describe what that felt like, because I think you need to understand it to understand everything that came after. It felt like being handed a document that describes a version of your life that you don't recognize. It felt like being told, there is a room in your house you didn't know existed and someone else has been decorating it for years. It felt like the floor had not disappeared but had simply become unreliable, and I was not sure how much weight it would hold. There had been no misconduct complaint. There had been nothing at my old job except 4 years of solid work, 2 promotions, and a going-away card that everyone in the office had signed. I had left voluntarily for a better opportunity. I had 2 months' notice. My former manager had written me a reference letter so warm I had kept it in a folder on my laptop. What there had been at that job was a man named Kenneth. Kenneth was a senior project manager, 8 years older than me, and for about 7 months in my 3rd year at the firm, we had been in a relationship. It had not ended well, which is to say it had ended, because he had wanted things to move faster than I did. And when I said I wasn't ready to move in together, he had taken that as something larger than it was. And the last few months of working in the same office had been uncomfortable in the way that only ends when one of you leaves. I left. Not because of him specifically, but because the opportunity I moved to was genuinely better, and because the air in that office had gotten hard to breathe. Kenneth and I had not spoken since. I knew, sitting at that kitchen counter, how my mother-in-law had found him. My husband had mentioned him once, years ago, in passing, in the context of me talking about leaving that job, and she had been in the room. She had a memory like a filing cabinet, and the organizational instincts of someone who had been running a household on tight margins for 30 years. She had found him. She had talked to him. And she had then called my former workplace with a story designed to make it sound like I had left under a cloud. I drove to my husband's apartment. We had not yet moved in together fully, which was a whole separate conversation we were having in slow motion. And I told him everything. Kenneth, the relationship, the end of it, the reason I had left the job, the fact that I had never told him the details because they had never seemed important, and because that chapter of my life had felt closed and quiet, and I hadn't wanted to drag it back out. I told him all of it, including the parts that didn't make me look entirely uncomplicated, because he was the man I was marrying, and he deserved the full version. He listened to everything. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he sat across from me for a moment, and then he said, "I'm going to ask you one question, and then I don't want to talk about Kenneth again unless you bring him up." I said, "Okay." He asked if I had been honest with him about who I was and what I wanted. I said yes. He said he knew. He said he'd known before I said it. That was the man I was marrying. But here is the thing about a well-planted doubt. It doesn't need the person who loves you to believe it. It just needs to exist in the air around you, to take up space, to make you feel like you are defending yourself when you should be celebrating. My mother-in-law knew this. She was not trying to convince my husband that I was a bad person. She was trying to make the 6 weeks before our wedding feel like a proceeding instead of a joy. She was trying to make me smaller, quieter, more apologetic. She was trying to shift the ground under me just enough that I would be off balance when I walked down the aisle. What she did not know was what had happened on my husband's end after her call to my old employer. And she did not know what Philippa had found. The engagement party had been my mother-in-law's idea, which, in retrospect, was a sign. It was held at her home in Hamilton 3 weeks before the wedding, a Sunday afternoon in July. Her backyard, about 30 guests, mostly family from her side, and a few of my husband's closest friends. She had offered to host it, and we had accepted because it seemed like a gesture of goodwill, and because my husband had been hoping, quietly and without saying it directly, that she was coming around. She was not coming around. I knew this by the way she watched me work the room. I knew it by the way she twice redirected conversations I was having with his aunts and cousins. I knew it by the way she smiled at me in photos, and then looked through me the moment the camera lowered. I was standing near the back fence with my husband's cousin, a cheerful woman in her 40s named Bet, who had already told me twice that she thought my husband had done well for himself, and meant it genuinely, when Philippa arrived. She had driven from Guelph, and she was 20 minutes late, and she was holding a paper coffee cup and wearing the expression she gets when she has information she needs to tell me, but hasn't decided how yet. She found me by the fence. She said hello to Bet with complete social ease. She asked if she could steal me for a second to look at something on her phone. We stepped around the side of the house, onto the narrow strip of concrete next to the air conditioning unit, which is not the setting you imagine for a turning point in your life. But here we were. She told me, been on the phone the previous evening with a friend of a friend who worked in HR at a firm in Mississauga. This woman, whose name Philippa mentioned and I have chosen to keep private, had been at an industry networking event 2 weeks earlier. At that event, she had run into Kenneth, and Kenneth, apparently believing he was among people who did not know me, had mentioned that he had recently been contacted by someone, an older woman, a mother of someone I was apparently about to marry, who had asked him to confirm that I had made a workplace complaint against him that had been quietly settled out of court. Kenneth had not confirmed this. He had told the woman that it wasn't true and that he didn't want to be involved. But he had also apparently felt uncomfortable enough about the whole thing that he had mentioned it to at least one person at that networking event, and that person had mentioned it to Philippa's contact. And Philippa's contact had mentioned it to Philippa. Philippa had then, being Philippa, spent the better part of 2 days figuring out exactly what had been said and to whom and whether there was a way to document it. She had sent a message to Kenneth directly, something short and matter-of-fact, asking if he was willing to put in writing what he had told that woman. He had said yes. He had sent her a 2-paragraph email that stated plainly that he had been contacted by a woman identifying herself as the mother of my fiancé, that she had asked him to verify a fabricated account of a workplace complaint, that he had declined, and that to his knowledge no such complaint had ever existed. Philippa handed me her phone. I stood next to the air conditioning unit, and I read the email. I read it twice, and then I stood there for a long moment while something very specific happened in my chest. It was not quite rage. It was the thing that comes before rage can even organize itself. The very cold, very clear recognition that someone has been working against you in rooms you couldn't see, for longer than you knew, with a precision that required planning. It was the particular loneliness of realizing that the person who should have been gaining you a family had instead been quietly building a case. I thought about the months of dinners, the dishes I had washed, the renovation story I had listened to for 3 hours, the way I had softened myself at every turn, not out of weakness but out of genuine effort, because I believed that people could come around if you gave them enough reason to. I had given her every reason I could think of. She had spent that time doing research. I went back into the backyard. My husband was near the drink table with his brother, and he looked up when he saw my face and immediately excused himself from the conversation without me saying a word. That's the thing about marrying someone who pays attention. They read you before you speak. I showed him Philippa's phone. He read the email once. He was quiet for a moment in the way that is not the absence of feeling but the presence of it, compressed and very still. He said, "Okay." I said, "I need to know what you want to do." He said, "I want to finish this party and then I want to have a conversation with my mother. And I want you standing next to me when I do." We finished the party. We ate the food his mother had made. We thanked the guests. We let his aunts take photographs. I smiled in everyone. My mother-in-law smiled in everyone. On the outside, we were a family at a celebration. On the inside, I was holding a piece of paper that described what she had done, and I was deciding what to do with it. The guests left in waves, the way they always do. The last few stragglers helping stack chairs, and asking if there was anything that needed carrying to the car. My parents had been there. My mum had hugged me 3 times throughout the afternoon, and my dad had spent 40 minutes talking to my father-in-law about hockey, which is its own kind of diplomacy, and they were among the last to go. My mum looked at me before she left with the expression she has had since I was a child, the one that says she knows something is happening and she will wait for me to tell her. I said I'd call her tomorrow. She said she'd be up. My father-in-law left shortly after. He is a quiet man who has spent decades being married to a loud woman and has developed a talent for reading rooms and choosing his exits carefully. He kissed his wife on the cheek, shook my husband's hand, and drove home to Hamilton. Then it was the 3 of us. My mother-in-law was stacking dessert plates in the kitchen. She had her back to us when we came in. My husband said her name. She turned around with the expression she uses for management, the one that is pleasant on the surface and prepared for argument underneath. My husband said, "We need to talk to you about something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." She looked at me, then she looked at him. Then she set the plates down. He told her what we knew. He told her about the call to my former workplace. He told her about Kenneth and the networking event, and what Kenneth had said to someone who had eventually said it to Philippa. He told her about the email. He laid it out evenly, without raising his voice, without editorializing, in the manner of a man who has made a decision about how this conversation would go and intends to stay in that lane no matter what. She interrupted twice. He stopped her both times. Not unkindly, but completely. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she had only been trying to make sure he was protected. That she had heard things. She did not specify from whom, and she had wanted to verify them. That any mother would have done the same. My husband said, any mother who trusted her son's judgment wouldn't have needed to. She looked at the counter. He told her what would happen from here. We would be getting married in 3 weeks. She was invited. But he needed her to understand, clearly and without softening, that what she had done was a deliberate attempt to damage the woman he had chosen, based on nothing except her own unwillingness to accept that his life was now also mine. He needed her to understand that if she chose to continue behaving this way after the wedding, she would see us less. Not as punishment, but as a boundary. A word she didn't like, but which he used anyway, calmly, twice. She didn't say she was sorry. I didn't expect her to. She said she would try. He said that was a start. I didn't say much. I had decided before we walked into that kitchen that this conversation belonged to my husband, because it was his family and his mother and his boundary to draw. And I had spent enough time in my life making myself the one who had to fix things that weren't mine to fix. I stood next to him. I held his hand. When she looked at me at the end, I held her gaze and I didn't look away and I didn't smile, and I think that said what I needed it to say. We got married 3 weeks later on a Saturday in August. The barn was everything we had planned it to be. There were wildflowers in mason jars on every table and string lights that turned the whole space gold after dark, and a playlist my husband and I had spent 3 evenings building together, because we couldn't agree on whether to include Early Tragically Hip, and ultimately decided yes. My dad cried during the ceremony. My mum did not cry, but held my dad's hand for the entire thing, which is their version of the same thing. Philippa gave a speech that was funny and sharp and ended with something she said she'd been writing for years, about how the best thing a person can do is find someone who makes them easier to be themselves. She looked at me when she said it. I had to look at the ceiling for a second. My mother-in-law attended. She wore a dark blue dress and she sat in the 3rd row, and she was, by all external appearances, a woman at her son's wedding. She did not make a scene. She did not make a speech. During the reception, she danced with my father-in-law and talked to my aunt for longer than I expected, and ate 2 pieces of cake, which felt like a neutral sign. I did not expect a transformation. I did not get one. What I got was a beginning, which was more than I had been sure of 3 weeks earlier. My husband cried during his vows. He had told me he wouldn't, and I had told him he would, and I was right, which I planned to bring up for the rest of our lives. After the ceremony, after the dinner, after the dancing had gone on long enough that the older guests had started sitting down, but the younger ones were still going, I stepped outside for a minute by myself. The field behind the barn was dark and cool and smelled like August, that particular dry grass and clover smell that Ontario gets in late summer. I stood out there for maybe 5 minutes. I thought about the parking lot in November where he had proposed. I thought about the conference in Ottawa where he had mispronounced a French word and caught my eye. I thought about all the things that could have been said or believed or swallowed down in the wrong direction, and how close we had come to standing on either side of a story someone else had written. And I thought about Kenneth, who had said no when asked to lie. I had not reached out to thank him, and I don't know that I will, but I thought about him. I thought about Philippa, who had driven to Hamilton to hand me something I needed before I needed to need it. There is a thing that happens when you have spent a long time proving yourself to someone who has already decided not to be convinced. You start to believe, on some level, that the jury is still out on you. That maybe she sees something the people who love you have missed. That if you could just find the right arrangement of words or gestures or dinners, you would finally be read correctly. I don't believe that anymore. Some people have already written the verdict before the evidence comes in. The only thing you can do is stop showing up to their courtroom. Build something so solid, in a life that is actually yours, that their rulings don't have anywhere to land. I walked back into the barn. My husband was on the dance floor with his brother, both of them moving badly in the way of men who are having too good a time to care. He saw me come back through the door and he lit up, the way he does, the way I hope he always will. I walked over and I took his hand, and I danced badly right alongside him. If this story found you at a moment when you needed it, When you've been standing in someone's kitchen being measured against a version of yourself you don't recognize, I want you to tell you I wish I had heard sooner. You don't have to earn your place in a life you have already built. You just have to stop letting someone else hold the measuring tape. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe to Pure Revenge Tales. Every story we share is for someone who needed to hear it today. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and come back for the next one. Because the truth always finds a way to the surface, and we'll be here when it does.